The morning sun blazed mercilessly across the Texas plains in 1847, painting the endless grassland in shades of gold and amber. Samuel Morrison wiped the sweat from his weathered face as he guided his cattle toward the watering hole near Sweetwater Creek. The drought had lasted 3 months, and every drop of water had become precious as gold. Samuel was a simple man who had built his ranch from nothing but determination and hard work. His calloused hands told the story of countless days mending fences, herding cattle, and fighting against the harsh elements of the frontier. He lived alone in a modest cabin, choosing the company of his livestock over the complications that came with neighbors. As his cattle spread out to drink from the shallow creek, Samuel noticed something unusual near the cluster of mesquite trees on the far bank. A figure lay motionless in the shade, partially hidden by the tall prairie grass. At first he thought it might be a fallen tree branch or perhaps a dead animal, but something about the shape made him look closer. Samuel dismounted his horse and walked carefully toward the figure, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle strapped to his saddle. The frontier had taught him to be cautious of anything unexpected. Indians and outlaws roamed these lands, and a lone cattleman could easily become prey if he let his guard down. As he drew nearer, Samuel realized it was a man, and from his clothing and features clearly a Native American. The stranger's dark hair was matted with dried blood, and his buckskin shirt was torn and stained with dirt and sweat. His breathing was shallow and labored, and his lips were cracked from thirst. Samuel paused, considering his options. Relations between white settlers and the local tribes had been tense for years. Many of his neighbors would have simply ridden away, or worse, seen this as an opportunity to eliminate a potential threat. But something about the wounded man's condition stirred Samuel's conscience. The stranger appeared to be in his 30s, with strong features and hands that spoke of a life spent outdoors. A crude bandage made from torn fabric was wrapped around his left shoulder, soaked through with blood. His horse was nowhere to be seen, and from the tracks in the dirt it appeared he had crawled to this spot seeking shade and water. Samuel knelt beside the unconscious man and gently shook his shoulder. The stranger's eyes fluttered open, revealing a mixture of pain and wariness. When he saw Samuel's face, his muscles tensed as if preparing for violence, but he was too weak to move. Samuel raised his hands in a peaceful gesture and pointed to his water canteen. The wounded man's eyes followed the movement, and Samuel could see the desperate thirst reflected in his gaze. Without hesitation, Samuel uncorked the canteen and carefully lifted the stranger's head, allowing him to drink slowly. The cool water seemed to bring some life back to the man's features. He drank gratefully, though Samuel was careful not to let him have too much at once. Years of living on the frontier had taught him that a person dying of thirst could make themselves sick by drinking too quickly. After the stranger had satisfied his immediate thirst, Samuel examined his wounds more closely. The shoulder injury appeared to be from a bullet, and it was clear that infection was beginning to set in. Without proper care, the man would likely die within a day or two. Samuel found himself at a crossroads that would define not only his character, but potentially change the course of many lives. He could easily walk away and let nature take its course, or he could risk everything to help a man that society told him was his enemy. Looking into the stranger's grateful eyes, Samuel made his decision. He would not let another human being die of thirst and neglect, regardless of the color of his skin or the tensions between their peoples. Samuel had always believed that a man's worth was measured by his actions in moments when no one was watching, and this was one of those moments. The stranger seemed to understand Samuel's intentions and nodded weakly, a gesture that transcended the language barrier between them. In that simple exchange, two men from different worlds found a common humanity that would soon ripple across the plains in ways neither could have imagined. Samuel knew he had to act quickly if the wounded stranger was going to survive. The infection in the man's shoulder was spreading, and the fever that had begun to set in would soon become deadly if left untreated. Samuel made the difficult decision to load the stranger onto his horse and take him back to his ranch, even though it meant leaving his cattle unattended at the waterhole. The journey back to Samuel's cabin was slow and careful. The wounded man drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes muttering words in his native language that Samuel couldn't understand. Samuel had to stop several times to give him more water and to adjust his position on the horse to prevent him from falling. When they finally reached the modest ranch house, Samuel carefully carried the stranger inside and laid him on his own bed. The cabin was simple but clean, with hand-hewn furniture that Samuel had made himself during the long winter months. Sunlight streamed through the single window, illuminating the sparse but functional interior. Samuel had learned basic medical care from an old army doctor who had passed through the area years earlier. He knew enough to clean wounds and treat simple injuries, skills that had served him well in the isolated frontier life. He heated water over his wood stove and gathered the supplies he would need: clean cloth for bandages, a bottle of whiskey for disinfecting, and a sharp knife that he sterilized in the flame of his oil lamp. The process of cleaning and treating the gunshot wound was difficult for both men. The stranger endured the pain with remarkable stoicism, clenching his teeth and gripping the wooden bed frame as Samuel worked. The bullet had passed clean through the shoulder, which was fortunate, but the wound had become badly infected during the days the man had spent crawling across the prairie. As Samuel worked, he noticed details about his patient that spoke to his character. The man's hands were calloused but well cared for, and his clothing, though torn and dirty, was well made and decorated with intricate beadwork. This was clearly not a random drifter, but someone of importance within his community. After cleaning and bandaging the wound, Samuel prepared a simple broth from beef and vegetables. The stranger was too weak to sit up, so Samuel had to feed him carefully, one spoonful at a time. Despite the language barrier, the man's grateful expression spoke volumes about his appreciation for the care he was receiving. As the day wore on, Samuel found himself studying his unexpected guest. The man appeared to be a skilled warrior, based on the scars that marked his arms and chest, evidence of previous battles and hunts. Yet there was also a gentleness in his manner that suggested he was more than just a fighter. That evening, as Samuel prepared to sleep on the floor beside his bed, the stranger spoke his first words in broken English. His voice was weak but clear as he said, "Thank you." The simple phrase carried enormous weight, representing not just gratitude for the immediate care, but acknowledgement of the risk Samuel had taken in helping him. Samuel replied simply, "Any man would do the same." But both men knew that wasn't true. The frontier was a harsh place where trust was rare and mercy often seen as weakness. Samuel's actions went against everything his neighbors would have expected, and both men understood the potential consequences. During the night, the stranger's fever broke, and by morning he was noticeably stronger. Samuel continued to tend to his wounds and provide regular meals, watching as his patient slowly regained his strength. The two men began to communicate through gestures and simple words, building a bridge of understanding across their cultural divide. On the third day, the stranger was able to sit up and take more solid food. He pointed to himself and said, "Running Bear," then gestured towards Samuel with a questioning look. Samuel responded by pointing to himself and saying his name clearly. This simple exchange of names marked a turning point in their relationship, transforming them from stranger and rescuer to two individuals sharing a common humanity. Running Bear began to sketch pictures in the dirt floor of the cabin, showing Samuel images of his village, his family, and the circumstances that had led to his injury. Through these drawings and gestures, Samuel learned that Running Bear had been shot during a hunting expedition when he had accidentally wandered too close to a white settlement. He had managed to escape but had been riding for days without food or water before his horse had finally collapsed. As Running Bear grew stronger, Samuel began to realize that his act of mercy had created a bond that would extend far beyond the walls of his simple cabin. The gratitude in Running Bear's eyes spoke of debts that would not be forgotten, and Samuel sensed that his decision to help a wounded stranger would have consequences that neither of them could yet imagine. Over the following week, Samuel and Running Bear developed an unlikely friendship that transcended their cultural differences. Each morning, Samuel would check Running Bear's wounds and change his bandages, pleased to see that the infection was finally clearing and healthy tissue was beginning to form. Running Bear's strength returned gradually, and with it came a natural curiosity about his rescuer's way of life. Running Bear proved to be an eager student of English, pointing to objects around the cabin and repeating the words Samuel taught him. In return, he shared words from his own language, teaching Samuel the names for common items and basic phrases. Samuel found himself fascinated by the complexity and beauty of Running Bear's native tongue, so different from his own harsh frontier dialect. As Running Bear grew stronger, He began to help with small tasks around the ranch. His movements were careful and deliberate, showing respect for Samuel's property and way of life. He proved remarkably skilled at tasks that Samuel had always struggled with, particularly anything involving animals. The cattle seemed to sense his presence and responded to his gentle approach with unusual calm. One morning, Samuel discovered that Running Bear had somehow managed to repair a section of fence that had been damaged weeks earlier. The work was expertly done, using techniques Samuel had never seen before but which seemed far more effective than his own methods. When Samuel expressed his amazement, Running Bear simply smiled and gestured toward the repaired fence, indicating that it was a small token of gratitude. The two men spent their evenings sitting on Samuel's porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie in brilliant colors. These quiet moments became opportunities for deeper communication, as they shared stories about their respective lives through a combination of words, gestures, and drawings in the dirt. Running Bear sketched images of his village, showing Samuel the teepees arranged in careful patterns, the central fire where the community gathered, and the vast herds of buffalo that provided for his people's needs. His drawings revealed a complex society with its own customs, laws, and traditions, very different from the savage stereotype that most white settlers held. In return, Samuel shared stories of his own past, explaining how he had come to Texas from Missouri after losing his family to disease. He spoke of his dreams of building something lasting on the frontier, of creating a place where a man could live free from the complications and conflicts of civilized society. Running Bear listened intently, seeming to understand more than his limited English would suggest. As the days passed, Samuel began to see the world through Running Bear's eyes, and the experience was both enlightening and troubling. Running Bear's people viewed the land not as something to be owned and exploited, but as a living entity to be respected and preserved. Their relationship with the animals and plants around them was based on taking only what was needed and giving back whenever possible. Samuel had always prided himself on being a fair and honest man, but Running Bear's perspective made him question some of his fundamental assumptions about progress and civilization. The systematic destruction of the buffalo herds, the fencing of the open range, and the displacement of native peoples began to seem less like inevitable progress and more like tragic losses. One evening, as they sat watching a spectacular sunset, Running Bear pointed to the horizon and spoke a long phrase in his native language. When Samuel asked for translation, Running Bear struggled for a moment before saying in broken English, "Land, not belong to man, man, belong to land." The simple statement carried profound implications that Samuel would think about for years to come. Despite their growing friendship, both men knew that their time together was limited. Running Bear's people would be searching for him, and his continued absence would cause them great concern. Moreover, Samuel's neighbors were beginning to ask questions about his extended absence from town and the mysterious activities around his ranch. One morning, Samuel woke to find Running Bear sitting up in bed, looking stronger than he had since his arrival. The wound in his shoulder had healed remarkably well, leaving only a small scar as evidence of his ordeal. Running Bear caught Samuel's eye and gestured toward the window, indicating that he felt ready to return to his people. Samuel felt a mixture of relief and sadness at this development. He had genuinely enjoyed Running Bear's company and had learned much from their time together, but he also understood the risks that came with harboring a Native American on his property, and he knew that Running Bear must be anxious to return to his family and community. That afternoon, Running Bear stood and walked outside for the first time since his arrival. He moved slowly but steadily, testing his strength and mobility. Samuel watched with satisfaction as his patient took his first steps toward recovery and eventual departure. As they prepared for Running Bear's return to his people, both men sensed that their unlikely friendship had changed them in fundamental ways. The trust they had built across cultural lines had opened their eyes to possibilities for understanding and cooperation that neither had previously imagined. Neither man could have predicted how profoundly their brief encounter would impact the future of both their communities. On Running Bear's final morning at the ranch, Samuel prepared a pack of supplies for his friend's journey home. He included dried beef, hardtack biscuits, a full water canteen, and some basic medical supplies in case the wound should give him trouble during the ride. Samuel had also decided to give Running Bear one of his horses, a gentle mare that would provide reliable transportation back to his village. As Samuel gathered these supplies, Running Bear sat quietly on the porch, his expression thoughtful and somewhat troubled. Samuel assumed his friend was simply nervous about the journey ahead or sad about their parting, but when Running Bear finally spoke, his words revealed something far more significant. "Samuel," Running Bear said, his English much improved after their weeks together, "I must tell you something important. I am not just warrior from my village." He paused, searching for the right words to explain his true identity. Samuel stopped his packing and looked at his friend with curiosity. During their time together, he had sensed that Running Bear held some position of importance among his people, but he had never pressed for details. Running Bear stood and walked to the edge of the porch, gazing out across the prairie toward his homeland. "In your words, I am chief. My father was great leader before me and his father before him. I lead 3 villages, maybe 400 people. They depend on me for decisions about war, peace, hunting, everything." The revelation hit Samuel like a thunderbolt. He had been caring for and befriending not just any Native American, but a chief responsible for hundreds of people. The implications of this discovery were staggering. Samuel realized that his simple act of mercy had potentially prevented a major conflict between Running Bear's people and the white settlers in the area. "When I was shot," Running Bear continued, "my warriors wanted to attack the settlement immediately. They thought I was dead, and they wanted revenge, but I told them to wait 3 days for my return. If I do not come back by tomorrow at sunset, they will come looking for me. And when they find what happened," he didn't need to finish the sentence. Samuel felt his blood run cold as he understood the full scope of what Running Bear was telling him. If the chief's warriors discovered that he had been shot by white men, they would almost certainly launch a massive retaliatory attack. The small settlement scattered across the region would be completely defenseless against several hundred angry warriors seeking vengeance for their leader's death. "But you're alive," Samuel said, trying to grasp the situation. "Surely they'll listen when you tell them what happened." Running Bear nodded slowly. "Yes, but they will want to know how I survived, who helped me. When I tell them about your kindness, about how you saved my life when you could have let me die." He paused, looking directly at Samuel. "This will change everything between our peoples." Samuel sat down heavily on a wooden crate, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had unknowingly set in motion. His simple decision to give water to a dying man had potentially prevented a war and might now create an entirely new relationship between the white settlers and the local tribes. Running Bear continued to explain the complex situation among his people. For months, younger warriors had been pushing for aggressive action against the encroaching white settlements. They had watched as their traditional hunting grounds were fenced off, as the buffalo herds dwindled, and as more and more settlers arrived to claim land that had belonged to their ancestors for generations. "Many of my young men think the only solution is war," Running Bear said. "They say white men only understand violence, that showing mercy is seen as weakness. But I have always believed there might be another way, a path of understanding between our peoples." Samuel began to understand that Running Bear's survival was about much more than saving one man's life. The chief's experience of white mercy and kindness would provide him with powerful ammunition to use against the war faction in his tribe. He could now speak from personal experience about the possibility of cooperation and mutual respect. "Your kindness has given me something precious," Running Bear explained. "It has given me proof that not all white men are enemies, that some understand honor and compassion. This is a weapon more powerful than any rifle in the fight for peace." As the morning wore on, Running Bear shared more details about the delicate political situation within his confederation of tribes. He explained how various chiefs and war leaders had been debating their response to the increasing white presence in their territory. Some advocated for immediate violent resistance, while others counseled patience and attempted negotiation. "When I return to my people today," Running Bear said, "I will tell them the story of Samuel Morrison, the white cattleman who saved the life of his enemy when he could have taken it. I will tell them that not all white men seek our destruction, that some are guided by the same honor and compassion that we value in our own culture." Samuel realized that his guest's departure would mark the beginning of something unprecedented in the region's history. Instead of another cycle of violence and retribution, Running Bear's survival might open the door to genuine communication and understanding between the two cultures. As they prepared the horse for Running Bear's departure, both men understood that they had become part of something much larger than their individual friendship. They had proven that trust and cooperation were possible across cultural lines, and that simple human decency could triumph over prejudice and fear. Running Bear's journey back to his village took most of the day, as he had to travel carefully to avoid being seen by white settlers who might not understand his peaceful intentions. Samuel had given him detailed directions to avoid the main settlements and travel through areas where he was less likely to encounter trouble. As Running Bear rode across the familiar landscapes of his homeland, he thought about the words he would use to describe his experience to his people. The story would be difficult for many to believe, particularly the young warriors who had spent their lives fighting against white encroachment on their territory. The sun was beginning to set when Running Bear finally reached the ridge overlooking his village. Below him, he could see the familiar circle of teepees arranged around the central fire, with smoke rising peacefully into the evening air. But something was different about the scene. There were far more horses than usual, and he could see warriors from other villages gathered in large groups around several fires. As Running Bear descended toward the village, scouts spotted him and rode out to meet him. Their faces showed a mixture of relief and amazement, as if they were seeing a ghost return from the dead. Word of his arrival spread quickly through the camp, and soon he was surrounded by warriors, elders, and family members who had feared they would never see him alive again. His younger brother, Swift Eagle, was the first to reach him. "Brother," he called out, tears streaming down his face. "We thought you were dead. The hunting party found your horse with blood on the saddle, and we feared the worst." Running Bear dismounted and embraced his brother, then looked around at the assembled crowd. He could see representatives from at least 6 different villages, all armed and painted for war. The sight filled him with both pride at their loyalty and concern about what their presence meant. "Why are so many warriors here?" Running Bear asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Swift Eagle's expression grew hard. "When we found your horse, we sent messengers to our allies. Every village that owes allegiance to our family has sent warriors. We have nearly 800 men ready to ride against the white settlements at dawn. We plan to avenge your death and drive the invaders from our lands once and for all." Running Bear felt the weight of Samuel's kindness even more heavily now. If he had died at Sweetwater Creek, this massive war party would have launched the largest Native American offensive in the region's history. The destruction would have been catastrophic for both sides, leading to years of bloody conflict and retaliation. "Gather the war council," Running Bear commanded. "I have a story to tell that will change everything." Within an hour, the most important chiefs and war leaders from the allied villages had assembled in Running Bear's teepee. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation and barely contained aggression. Many of these men had ridden hard for days, expecting to participate in a great battle that would settle the question of white presence in their territory once and for all. Running Bear began his tale carefully, knowing that every word would be scrutinized and debated. He described the hunting expedition, the encounter with the white patrol that had led to his being shot, and his desperate flight across the prairie. The assembled leaders listened intently, their faces growing harder as they heard about his suffering. Then Running Bear reached the crucial moment in his story. "I crawled to Sweetwater Creek expecting to die in the shade of the mesquite trees. My spirit was preparing to join our ancestors when a white man found me. The reaction in the teepee was immediate and intense. Several warriors reached for their weapons, assuming that Running Bear's capture had led to torture or further humiliation. But Running Bear raised his hand for silence and continued. This white man, Samuel Morrison, saw that I was wounded and dying of thirst. He could have killed me easily or simply ridden away and left me to die. Instead, he gave me water from his own canteen. He carried me to his home and cared for my wounds as if I were his own brother." The silence in the teepee was profound. Many of the warriors looked skeptical, unable to believe that any white man would show such mercy to an enemy. But Running Bear's reputation for honesty was unquestioned, and his physical presence proved that someone had indeed saved his life. For more than a week, this man fed me, gave me his own bed, and tended my wounds with the skill of a medicine man. He asked for nothing in return. When I was strong enough to travel, he gave me a horse and supplies for the journey home. He risked his own safety to save the life of a stranger. Old Bear Claw, the most respected war chief among the allied tribes, spoke first. These are strange words, Running Bear. In all my years of fighting the white invaders, I have never seen such behavior. How do we know this is not some trick, some trap to catch us off guard? Running Bear had anticipated this question. He reached into his pack and pulled out several items that Samuel had given him. The medical supplies, the distinctive style of rope that white cattlemen used, and a small carved wooden figure that Samuel had whittled during their evenings together. These are gifts from Samuel Morrison, Running Bear said. But more important than these objects is what he has given me. Proof that not all white men are our enemies, that some understand honor and mercy just as we do. The debate that followed was intense and sometimes heated. Some warriors argued that Running Bear's experience was an exception, that one kind white man did not change the fundamental threat that white settlement posed to their way of life. Others began to see possibilities for a different kind of relationship with the white settlers, one based on mutual respect rather than constant warfare. The War Council continued through the night, with passionate arguments on both sides. Young warriors who had been eager for battle found it difficult to accept that their carefully planned offensive should be called off because of one white man's kindness. They argued that Samuel Morrison's actions were an anomaly, that the vast majority of white settlers remained their enemies, who would show no mercy if given the chance. Swift Eagle was among the most vocal opponents of changing their plans. "Brother," he said, "your experience with this Morrison shows that he is different from the others. But what about the men who shot you? What about those who have stolen our hunting grounds and killed our buffalo? One good man does not erase the crimes of hundreds." Running Bear listened carefully to each speaker, understanding their anger and frustration. These were men who had watched their traditional way of life come under constant attack, who had seen their children go hungry as the buffalo herds dwindled, who had witnessed the destruction of sacred sites by white settlers who understood nothing of their significance. But as the night wore on, Running Bear noticed that the older chiefs were beginning to see the wisdom in his perspective. These were men who had lived through decades of warfare and understood its true costs. They had seen too many young warriors die in battles that solved nothing, too many villages destroyed in cycles of revenge that benefited no one. Old Bear Claw finally stood to address the council. "I have fought the white men for 30 winters," he said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned experience. "I have killed many of them, and they have killed many of our people. But in all that time, the white men have only grown stronger and more numerous, while our people have grown fewer." He paused, looking around the circle of faces illuminated by the fire's flickering light. Perhaps it is time to try a different path. Running Bear's story tells us that some white men can be reached with words rather than weapons. If this is true, then we owe it to our children to explore this possibility. The debate that followed Old Bear Claw's words was more thoughtful and less heated. Warriors began to consider what might be possible if they could establish peaceful relations with at least some of the white settlers. They discussed the potential for trade, for shared use of certain lands, and for agreements that might protect their most sacred sites. As dawn approached, Running Bear made his final argument to the council. "My friends," he said, "Samuel Morrison's kindness has given us something we have never had before. Proof that peace is possible. If we attack the white settlements now, we will be no different from those who shot me without cause. We will be choosing the path of violence when a path of honor has been offered to us." He stood and walked to the center of the circle, his presence commanding the attention of every man in the tepee. "I propose that we send a delegation to meet with Samuel Morrison and the other white leaders. Let us see if his kindness extends to his people, if they are willing to listen to our words as he listened to mine." The reaction to this proposal was mixed. Some warriors saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate their strength while exploring possibilities for peace. Others viewed it as a dangerous sign of weakness that would only encourage further white aggression. Young Buffalo Horn, a war chief known for his fierce hatred of white settlers, stood to oppose the plan. "And what if this delegation is killed or captured? What if this Morrison betrays our trust and leads soldiers to our villages? We would be trading our strength for empty promises." Running Bear nodded respectfully to Buffalo Horn. "These are valid concerns, my friend, but consider this. If we attack now, we will certainly face the soldiers that you fear. The white men will call for help from their army, and we will face not dozens but thousands of armed men. Our victory, if it comes at all, will be temporary." The discussion continued as the sun rose higher, but gradually a consensus began to emerge. The assembled chiefs agreed that Running Bear's experience had changed the situation enough to warrant trying a different approach. They would postpone the planned attack and instead send a carefully chosen delegation to meet with Samuel Morrison and other white leaders. The terms of this delegation were debated carefully. It would include representatives from several villages, led by Running Bear himself. They would approach under a flag of truce and seek a meeting with the most influential white settlers in the region. The delegation would carry gifts as a sign of peaceful intentions and would present a proposal for coexistence rather than conflict. However, the council also made it clear that this would be their only attempt at peace. If the white settlers showed no interest in negotiation, or if any harm came to the delegation, then the full force of the allied tribes would be unleashed against the settlements. As the council concluded, Running Bear felt the enormous weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Samuel Morrison's act of kindness had prevented an immediate war, but now it fell to Running Bear to build something lasting from that foundation of mercy and trust. The warriors began to disperse to their respective villages to share the council's decision with their people. Some left disappointed that their chance for glorious battle had been postponed, while others departed with hope that a new era of peace might be possible. Running Bear spent the rest of the day preparing for what would be the most important mission of his life. He selected gifts that would demonstrate his people's skill and artistry, beautifully crafted weapons, intricate beadwork, and ceremonial items that spoke to the richness of their culture. Most importantly, he prepared the words he would use to convince Samuel Morrison and his neighbors that peace was not only possible, but preferable to the alternative. 3 days later, Samuel Morrison was working near his cattle when he spotted something on the horizon that made his blood run cold. A long line of mounted figures was approaching across the prairie, their silhouettes dark against the morning sky. As they drew closer, Samuel could see that it was a large group of Native American warriors, perhaps 50 or more, riding in formation toward his ranch. Samuel's first instinct was to run for his rifle and prepare to defend his property. Stories of Indian raids were common throughout the territory, and a lone rancher would stand little chance against such numbers. But as the riders came nearer, Samuel noticed something unusual about their approach. They carried what appeared to be a white flag, and their formation was orderly rather than aggressive. When the group stopped about 100 yards from his cabin, Samuel recognized the lead rider immediately. It was Running Bear, sitting tall and proud on a magnificent painted horse, looking every inch the chief that Samuel now knew him to be. The sight of his former patient alive and well filled Samuel with relief, but the presence of so many armed warriors also filled him with apprehension. Running Bear dismounted and walked slowly toward Samuel, his hands visible and empty of weapons. Behind him, the other warriors remained mounted but relaxed, their weapons lowered in a clear gesture of peaceful intentions. When Running Bear reached speaking distance, he called out in his improved English, "Samuel Morrison, my friend," Running Bear said, his voice carrying clearly across the prairie air. "I have returned as I promised, but I have brought others with me. We come in peace, seeking words, not war." Samuel walked forward to meet his friend, aware that every eye in the war party was watching their interaction. The two men clasped hands in greeting, a gesture that sent a visible ripple of surprise through the assembled warriors. Many had never seen their chief show such familiarity with a white man. "Running Bear," Samuel said, relief evident in his voice. "I'm glad to see you well. But I have to admit, 50 armed warriors is quite an escort for a social visit." Running Bear smiled at his friend's directness. "They are here because of what you did for me, Samuel. Your kindness has prevented a war that would have destroyed both our peoples. Now we seek to build something better in its place." Over the next hour, Running Bear explained the situation to Samuel. He described the War Council's original plans for a massive attack on the white settlements, and how Samuel's act of mercy had changed everything. The delegation had come not to threaten, but to propose a new relationship between their peoples, one based on mutual respect and cooperation rather than suspicion and violence. Samuel listened with growing amazement as he learned how his simple decision to help a wounded stranger had prevented bloodshed on an enormous scale. He began to understand that Running Bear's visit represented an unprecedented opportunity for peace in a region that had known little but conflict and mistrust. Word of the Indian delegation's peaceful arrival spread quickly through the scattered white settlements. Within hours, curious settlers began arriving at Samuel's ranch to witness this historic meeting. Some came armed and suspicious, expecting trouble, while others arrived hopeful that this might mark the beginning of a new era of coexistence. By afternoon, a crowd of nearly 100 white settlers had gathered around Samuel's cabin, including several local leaders and even a territorial magistrate who had ridden hard from the county seat. The atmosphere was tense but not hostile, as both groups seemed to recognize the significance of what was happening. Running Bear addressed the assembled white settlers through Samuel, who served as interpreter and mediator. The chief spoke eloquently about his people's desire for peace, their willingness to share the land rather than fight over it, and their hope that Samuel Morrison's example of mercy and honor could serve as a foundation for lasting friendship between their communities. The response from the white settlers was mixed but generally more positive than anyone had dared hope. The territorial magistrate, a practical man named Judge Harrison, recognized the enormous opportunity that Running Bear's offer represented. He had seen enough frontier warfare to understand that a peaceful resolution would benefit everyone involved. "Chief Running Bear," Judge Harrison said through Samuel's translation, "your proposal intrigues us. But many of our people have suffered losses in conflicts with other tribes. How can we be sure that this peace will hold, that other war parties won't see our cooperation as weakness?" Running Bear had anticipated this question. He gestured toward his assembled warriors and spoke with quiet authority. "These men represent 6 villages and nearly 1,000 warriors. They followed me here ready for war, but they have chosen to listen to words of peace instead. When we return to our villages, we will carry the story of this day to every tribe in the region. Your kindness to one wounded man has earned you the protection of all our people." The negotiations that followed were complex and sometimes difficult, but they were conducted in a spirit of genuine goodwill that surprised everyone present. Both sides recognized that they had been given an extraordinary opportunity to break the cycle of violence that had plagued the frontier for decades. Over the course of 3 days, with Samuel's ranch serving as neutral ground, the two groups hammered out the framework for what would become known as the Sweetwater Accord. The agreement established boundaries that both sides would respect, created mechanisms for resolving disputes peacefully, and laid the groundwork for beneficial trade relationships. The white settlers agreed to recognize certain areas as sacred to the Native Americans and to limit their hunting of buffalo to sustainable levels. In return, Running Bear's people promised safe passage for white travelers and traders, and agreed to help track down any rogue war parties that might threaten the peace. Perhaps most importantly, the accord established Samuel Morrison's ranch as a permanent meeting place, where representatives from both communities could gather to discuss problems and opportunities. Samuel, somewhat reluctantly, agreed to serve as the official mediator and liaison between the two groups. As the negotiations concluded and the various parties prepared to return to their homes, Running Bear pulled Samuel aside for a private conversation. "My friend," he said, "you gave water to a dying man beside a creek thinking you were saving one life. But your kindness has saved hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives that would have been lost in the war we planned." Samuel looked out across the prairie where white settlers and Native American warriors were, sharing meals and trading stories around common campfires. The sight still seemed almost impossible to believe. "I just did what seemed right at the time," he said simply. "That is exactly why it worked," Running Bear replied. "You acted from your heart, without thinking about the consequences or what others might say. That kind of pure kindness has a power that no weapon can match." The delegations departed the next morning, carrying word of the historic agreement back to their respective communities. The Sweetwater Accord would be tested many times in the years that followed, but it held firm, creating an island of peace in a region that had known too much conflict. Samuel Morrison lived to see his simple ranch become a symbol of hope and cooperation throughout the territory. Travelers would often detour from their routes just to visit the place where enemies had chosen to become friends, where a cup of water offered to a stranger had changed the destiny of two peoples. The story of Samuel's kindness and Running Bear's gratitude spread far beyond the Texas plains, inspiring similar acts of mercy and understanding across the frontier. It proved that even in the harshest circumstances, individual acts of compassion could triumph over fear and prejudice. creating possibilities that no one had dared to imagine. In the end, the wounded stranger that Samuel had found beside Sweetwater Creek had brought him far more than he had given. In saving one life, Samuel had discovered the profound truth that mercy and kindness, when freely given, have the power to transform not just individuals but entire communities, creating ripples of positive change that can last for generations.